What does it take to make a country stop fighting after firing 9,000 missiles? Iran has already answered that question, and the answer should worry everyone watching this war unfold. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next in this story. Give this video a like if you think people deserve the real picture, not the polished version. And send this to one person who still believes this war is small and far away, because it isn't anymore. For a long time. This conflict was described in careful, gentle language. Officials called every strike limited. They called every response measured. Reporters used words like contained and controlled, so often that people almost forgot they were describing a real war with real casualties. But numbers don't lie the way language can. 9,000 missiles and drones. That is the figure now being quietly confirmed by intelligence sources tracking Iran's strikes across this expanding conflict. 9,000. Not fired all at once, but launched steadily, wave after wave, month after month, at military targets across the region. And here's the part that should really catch your attention. Analysts spent months insisting Iran was almost out of ammunition. They said the stockpiles were thin, the factories were damaged, and the war was close to running out of fuel on Iran's side. The math never added up. If Iran was truly running dry, 9,000 missiles should have emptied the shelves a long time ago. Instead, Iran kept firing, kept striking, and kept refusing to back down. So the real question isn't why Iran hasn't stopped. The real question is why anyone believed Iran would stop in the first place. To understand where we are now, you have to understand how small this war used to look on paper. It didn't begin with missiles flying into major cities or tankers burning in open water. It began quietly, almost boringly, with a decision by Saudi Arabia to escalate its long fight against the Houthi movement in Yemen. That single decision was supposed to be contained inside Yemen's borders. It wasn't. The Houthis answered by tightening pressure on shipping lanes near their coast, and then by striking a major oil refinery deep inside Saudi territory. Saudi Arabia responded through proxies on the ground, hoping to avoid a direct and obvious escalation. But the Houthis struck again, this time hitting a second refinery, and this attack cut even deeper into Saudi energy infrastructure. Here's where the story takes its first strange turn. Saudi officials didn't blame Yemen for that second strike. They blamed Iraq. Whether that accusation was accurate or convenient is still debated, but it didn't matter in the moment. It became justification. The very next day, American and Saudi forces launched coordinated strikes inside Iraqi territory, killing close to 20 fighters tied to state-aligned security forces, along with several members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard who were reportedly present. That single set of strikes changed everything, because Iraq is not a side character in this region. Iraq has a population and a military force that dwarfs Saudi Arabia's. Iran, standing behind Iraq, dwarfs Saudi Arabia even further. Even the Houthi movement alone may rival Saudi military strength on certain fronts. Saudi Arabia, a nation of roughly 32 million people, was now facing hostility on multiple fronts at once, stretched thin against opponents with far greater manpower and far deeper resolve. This is one of the oldest mistakes in military history. You do not open new fronts when you cannot fully close the ones you already have. Generals have known this for centuries, and history is full of examples of powerful armies stretching themselves too thin until the weight of too many battlefields finally cracked them from the inside. Yet that is exactly the pattern this war kept repeating. Again and again, one retaliation pulling in one more country that never asked to be part of the fight. Each new front adding fresh strain to a military structure already stretched across land, sea, and sky. What makes this chain reaction so dangerous is how ordinary it looked at every single step. No single decision felt like the moment. The entire region tipped into open war. Each strike looked on its own like a reasonable response to the one before it. But add them together, week after week, and you get a war that nobody planned in one sitting, built instead out of dozens of smaller choices that all pointed in the same direction. And then, almost overnight, Iran did something it hadn't done before in quite this way. It struck a military airbase inside Jordan, a country that had spent decades carefully staying out of direct confrontation. According to Iranian statements, the target was a cluster of advanced fighter jets sitting on the runway, and several of them reportedly never took off again. At nearly the same time, oil tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz were warned, then struck, and reportedly left stranded in the water. American officials responded almost immediately, insisting every incoming missile had been intercepted, that nothing had actually landed. But footage that surfaced in the following hours told a different story, one that didn't match the official denial at all. This has become the defining rhythm of this entire war. One side insists everything is under control. The other side releases footage suggesting otherwise. And somewhere between those two competing claims sits a truth that neither government seems willing to fully admit out loud. So why strike Jordan specifically, a country that wasn't even a direct participant in the fighting? According to people close to regional intelligence circles, the timing wasn't random at all. It came almost immediately after a private meeting between American and Israeli leadership. A meeting where, according to these same sources, plans for a new operation against Iran were reportedly being finalized. If that's accurate, then the strike on Jordan wasn't random aggression. It was a warning shot, an attempt to disrupt something before it could even begin. A message sent not through diplomatic channels, but through fire aimed at making one point unmistakably clear. Any plan built in secret could be answered just as quickly. There's also a quieter, more human layer buried underneath all of this military strategy. Many analysts expect Iraqi retaliation to be delayed, not because of weakness, but because of respect. A major religious pilgrimage is happening across the region right now, drawing millions of travelers along shared roads and shared cities. Nobody wants to turn a sacred journey into a battlefield. So even in the middle of open hostility, there's a pause, a small reminder that human decency hasn't completely disappeared, even inside a war this ugly. Then there's the strike on Iran itself, the one still surrounded by confusion. Washington couldn't even agree on how many missiles were fired. Some officials said 5, others said 6. All of them insisted every single one was intercepted before impact. But if that's true, why does footage appear to show real damage on the ground? Why would Iran openly claim a successful hit on American fighter jets if nothing actually happened? One theory worth considering is that Iran anticipated a fresh wave of American strikes and decided to move first, hitting jet capability that could have been used against it before that capability could ever be deployed. If that theory holds, then what looked like unprovoked aggression may actually have been a calculated defensive strike, meant to remove a future threat before it could materialize. And despite hopeful talk over the past weekend about renewed diplomacy, despite mediation efforts from regional powers trying to cool things down, the situation on the ground tells a very different story. Iran's position has remained firm. Before any nuclear discussions can even begin, Iran wants foreign military forces removed from southern Lebanon. It wants the blockade lifted. It wants sanctions dropped. It wants its frozen financial assets released. Now, not promised for some vague point in the future, the American position remains the exact opposite. Nuclear negotiations first, everything else later. Two positions, standing completely still, facing each other with no visible bridge connecting them. If this is starting to make you uneasy, that's the right reaction. And if you want to actually understand where this goes next, instead of just reacting to headlines, subscribe now, because the details ahead reveal just how much bigger this war has already become. There's another incident worth examining closely, because it adds an entirely new layer to an already complicated crisis. Near Egypt, an American fuel tanker carrying liquefied natural gas was struck by a drone while docked at port in broad daylight during the early afternoon. Officials in Washington confirmed they were briefed on the attack almost immediately, and just like before, blame was quickly directed at Iran, even though no confirmed evidence existed at the time identifying who actually launched that drone. This is one of the most dangerous habits of modern warfare. Blame moves faster than proof. Someone gets accused before anyone actually confirms what happened, and once that accusation becomes public, it becomes almost impossible to walk back, even if later evidence tells a different story entirely. Following that tanker strike, promises of retaliation came quickly, described almost casually as simply taking a turn, as though this entire deadly exchange were some kind of game where both sides trade blows back and forth evenly. But war doesn't work like a game with fair turns. Every strike costs real money, real equipment, and very often, real human lives. Consider the simple arithmetic here. If 5 missiles are fired and all 5 are supposedly intercepted, that likely means at least 10 defensive interceptors were used to stop them, sometimes more, because modern defense systems frequently fire 2 interceptors per incoming threat, just to guarantee a hit. Each interceptor costs several $1,000,000. Multiply that across an entire sustained war, and you start to see something officials rarely say out loud in public. This isn't only a war fought with soldiers and territory anymore, it's a war of budgets, and one side is burning through resources at a pace that simply cannot continue forever. Meanwhile, Iran appears to be playing a very different kind of game, quieter and far more patient. Instead of trading missile for missile in a straight exchange, reports suggest Iran has spent months systematically dismantling radar systems and satellite tracking infrastructure used to monitor its movements. Close to 20 of these systems have reportedly already been destroyed. Think about what that actually means. It isn't only about blowing things up. It's about blinding an opponent, stripping away the ability to see threats coming before they arrive. Even officials on the American side have quietly acknowledged that early warning radar capability, something long relied upon in this region, is no longer functioning the way it once did. At the same time, American forces have reportedly begun shifting away from traditional bases, relocating personnel and aircraft to alternate locations outside places long considered secure and stable strongholds. Why would that kind of quiet relocation be happening if everything were truly under control? There's also a political shift building inside Jordan itself. Under growing pressure, a large group of political, military, and economic figures reportedly signed and published an open letter addressing the country's leadership directly, essentially demanding that foreign military presence be removed from Jordanian soil entirely. This isn't just one letter from one frustrated group. It reflects a wider sentiment spreading across the region, a quiet but increasingly loud message that foreign military presence is no longer welcome, not in Jordan, not in Iraq, not in most of the places that once tolerated it without much resistance. There was also a strange, almost overlooked moment tied to a funeral. During a gathering meant to honor a fallen political figure, a private meeting reportedly took place behind closed doors. Shortly afterward, Ukraine's foreign ministry reached out directly to Iranian officials, essentially apologizing for an earlier incident involving an attack in the Caspian Sea, calling it a mistake rather than an intentional act. Why would that small diplomatic gesture matter at all? Because it suggests real fear, behind closed doors, of this war spreading even wider than it already has. Fear strong enough that a completely unrelated country involved in a completely different war felt compelled to step back and calm the waters immediately. Financial markets are already reacting to all of this uncertainty in real time. Just as cautious optimism briefly returned and stock values began climbing again, renewed threats of escalation sent everything crashing back down within hours. Major stock indexes dropped by hundreds of points in a single trading day. Oil prices, which had briefly cooled, spiked back above $90 a barrel almost immediately. This is the real, tangible cost of uncertainty. It isn't abstract. It shows up directly at the gas pump, inside retirement accounts, and in the price of everyday goods that depend on transportation and stable energy supply. Ordinary people, thousands of miles away from any actual battlefield, are already feeling the financial pressure of this conflict in their daily lives. There's also growing concern around shipping fees near one of the most heavily used waterways in the world. If armed groups begin restricting passage or demanding tolls through these routes, global trade could face serious disruption almost overnight. And that brings us to something that matters even more than any single missile strike. Some experts now believe this narrow stretch of water connecting the Red Sea to the wider ocean has quietly become more strategically important than the traditional oil corridors that dominated headlines for decades. If that passage becomes unreliable, ships are forced onto alternate routes, sometimes sailing all the way around the southern tip of Africa. According to strategic assessments studying exactly this scenario, that detour can double shipping. Costs, sometimes more, depending on the destination. This isn't only a regional problem anymore, it's a global economic problem. That's precisely why major shipping regulators, insurance companies, humanitarian organizations, and defense agencies across multiple continents have quietly reached the same unsettling conclusion. The center of strategic competition is shifting away from older, familiar flashpoints toward this narrower, far more fragile passage. Think about what that means for a container of medicine, a shipment of grain, or a batch of electronics parts sitting on a cargo ship somewhere in the middle of the ocean right now. None of those goods care about politics. They only care about the safest, fastest route home. And if that route keeps shrinking, prices for everyday products, the kind that fill supermarket shelves and hospital supply rooms, quietly start climbing everywhere, long before most people even realize why. And there's a much larger pattern hiding underneath all of this immediate chaos, something most people never even stop to consider. For centuries, global trade has depended almost entirely on the ocean, on ships carrying goods from one side of the planet to the other. But slowly, quietly, a different kind of infrastructure has been rising. Massive overland railway and highway networks stretching across entire continents, built specifically to reduce dependence on sea routes altogether. If that shift continues to accelerate, the nations controlling these land corridors gain enormous influence that no longer depends on controlling the oceans at all. This single transition could quietly redefine global trade for the next century, shifting power away from traditional naval strength toward countries with strong internal transportation systems instead. And whether intentionally or not, every missile fired, every tanker halted, every disrupted shipping lane in this current war is quietly accelerating that exact transition. If this is starting to feel like something much bigger than a simple regional conflict, that's because it is. Drop one word in the comments describing how this story makes you feel. Because honestly, I want to know if I'm the only one who finds this genuinely unsettling. Now let's look at something even more revealing, something that exposes just how strained certain military resources have actually become. During earlier phases of this conflict, a surprising number of strikes weren't carried out using the most advanced precision weapons available. Instead, many attacks relied on simpler guided bombs, essentially older explosives fitted with inexpensive guidance kits that let them glide toward a target instead of dropping straight down. These weapons have a limited range, roughly 40 kilometers at best. That detail matters because it explains something important. Most of these strikes have happened close to coastlines, not deep inside enemy territory, not because that positioning is strategically ideal, but because it's simply as far as these particular weapons can reach. Compare that to long-range guided munitions used elsewhere in the world, weapons capable of traveling well over 100 miles while carrying a much heavier payload. That gap in capability is enormous, and it quietly reveals something uncomfortable about the true state of military readiness on one side of this fight. When a force built around long-range precision strikes suddenly starts relying on shorter-range, cheaper alternatives, it usually isn't a strategic choice. It's a sign that the preferred option is running low, and commanders are quietly adapting to what's actually left in the warehouse rather than what looks best on paper. There's also reportedly real tension building at the highest levels of military leadership. Sources describe growing disagreement between commanders overseeing regional operations and top leadership responsible for global strategy as a whole. One side reportedly believes current operations can continue indefinitely without serious consequence. The other side, responsible for maintaining readiness across every other region on Earth, understands a much harsher truth. Every missile fired here is one less missile available if an entirely different crisis erupts somewhere else on the planet. This is the quiet, unglamorous reality of modern warfare. You cannot fight forever without eventually running short on the tools required to keep fighting, and that shortage is becoming harder and harder to hide. According to intelligence estimates shared by knowledgeable sources, Iran alone has reportedly launched somewhere around 9,000 missiles and drones toward opposing military assets. Since this phase of the conflict escalated, 9,000. Before this latest wave began, many analysts confidently predicted Iran's stockpiles were nearly exhausted after earlier rounds of fighting. But the numbers tell a completely different story, one of sustained capability rather than exhaustion. Part of the explanation may lie in something surprisingly practical. Rather than only building brand new missiles from scratch, reports suggest Iran has been refurbishing older models, extending their usable lifespan, and stretching existing resources far further than most analysts expected. There's also the issue of visibility. Iran's missile production and storage infrastructure is largely built underground, hidden from satellite surveillance, and extremely difficult to infiltrate using human intelligence, according to sources with intelligence community connections. Current estimates suggest roughly 60% of Iran's original missile stockpile remains fully operational and usable. If that estimate is accurate, it means the widely repeated assumption that Iran was running out of firepower may have been dangerously wrong from the very beginning. And every prediction built on top of that assumption, including timelines for how long this war might last, may need to be rewritten entirely. This underground infrastructure doesn't stop at missiles either. Reports describe extensive systems involving drones, naval mines, and small, fast attack vessels, all built and maintained largely out of sight, all supported by a domestic supply chain that appears strong enough to keep producing weapons despite years of sustained economic pressure and sanctions. That raises a genuinely uncomfortable question for anyone hoping this war ends quickly. If one side can keep manufacturing weapons faster than they're being destroyed, how exactly does this conflict reach any kind of natural conclusion? There's also serious concern about vulnerability on the Israeli side of this conflict. Reports indicate that air defense capacity has become significantly depleted after repeated waves of sustained attacks. Even more concerning, damage has reportedly been done to critical refining infrastructure responsible for producing diesel and aviation fuel, resources essential for both civilian life and continued military operations. If Iran were to launch a renewed, concentrated attack specifically targeting Israel, some analysts suggest there may now be very limited capability left to stop it. And unlike earlier rounds of damage, some of this destruction may not be quickly repairable, representing potentially long-term harm to critical infrastructure, rather than something that simply gets patched up within weeks. This is likely why, according to insider accounts, there's been a quiet effort to minimize public attention on Israel's direct role in recent strikes. Officials reportedly want to avoid drawing focus toward vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit even further. But hiding a vulnerability doesn't erase it. It only delays the moment when that vulnerability becomes impossible to ignore. At this point, it's worth asking yourself something honestly. If both major military powers involved in this conflict are quietly running low on defenses, resources, and sustainable options, what does that actually mean for how this war eventually ends? Some analysts believe the most likely outcome isn't a clean military victory for either side, but sheer economic exhaustion instead. Without stable access to the region's oil resources, particularly the specific heavy, sulfur-rich crude oil that only a handful of refineries worldwide are actually built to process, Fuel shortages will keep tightening across major economies in Asia, Europe, and beyond. This isn't something that can simply be replaced with a different type of oil sourced from somewhere else. The infrastructure needed to process that exact crude only exists in a few key regions, and every one of them is now touched in some way by this expanding conflict. Eventually, according to this theory, continuing the war becomes economically unsustainable long before it ever becomes militarily unwinnable. If that's true, then the real force ending this war might not be a peace treaty or a battlefield defeat at all. It might simply be the moment someone finally admits, quietly and privately, that there isn't enough left to keep going. There's something deeply human buried underneath all of this analysis, something easy to lose sight of amid missile counts and stock market charts. Real people are living inside this uncertainty right now. Families are watching oil prices climb and wondering whether they can afford to heat their homes this winter. Workers are watching their retirement savings swing wildly with every new headline. Entire communities near ports, refineries, and shipping lanes are living with genuine fear that their region could become the next unexpected target overnight. This war isn't happening in some distant, abstract space disconnected from ordinary life. It's already reaching into grocery prices, fuel costs, and financial stability for millions of people who never asked to be part of any of it. A parent filling up a car in a country thousands of miles from the fighting, a small business owner watching shipping costs rise on imported parts, a retiree checking a shrinking investment account. None of them chose this war, yet all of them are already paying for it in small, quiet ways that add up over time. And that's exactly why understanding what's really happening matters so much, not to make you afraid, but to make you informed. Informed people ask better questions. They see through simple explanations for deeply complicated problems, and they don't panic at the first confident headline that claims to have all the answers. If you've made it this far into the story, you clearly care about the full picture, not just the surface. So do one small thing for me right now. Tap that like button, because it genuinely helps this kind of deeper breakdown reach more people who need to see it instead of getting buried by shorter, shallower content. So where does all of this actually lead? There's a pattern worth paying close attention to here. Historically, whenever military pressure builds significantly against certain factions in this region, there tends to be a sudden, almost convenient announcement of progress toward peace. Confident claims emerge that negotiations are close, that the other side is exhausted and finally ready to talk, that resolution is just around the corner. And then, almost predictably, fighting resumes shortly after. Many analysts strongly suspect this exact pattern will repeat here as well. Optimistic statements may return. Talk of imminent negotiations may resurface in the news cycle, but underneath that surface-level optimism, the fundamental disagreements remain completely unresolved. Foreign troop withdrawal, lifted sanctions, unfrozen assets on one side, nuclear program restrictions on the other. There's also a harder truth worth confronting, honestly. The longer this war continues, the more fronts that open. Around it, the fewer realistic paths toward de-escalation actually remain available. Every additional strike, every additional country pulled into the fighting makes stepping back politically and strategically more difficult than it was the day before. From a purely strategic standpoint, continued conflict and instability can sometimes serve certain interests better than a genuine peace ever could. That's an uncomfortable thought, but it's worth sitting with honestly rather than dismissing it outright. But ever could. That's an uncomfortable thought, but it's worth sitting with honestly rather than dismissing it outright. But here's the piece so many people overlook completely. Continuing a war requires resources. It requires functioning supply chains, financial stability, sustained public support, and genuinely sustainable military capability. And nearly every piece of evidence examined throughout this story points towards serious strain across almost all of those categories at once. Military history has shown again and again that raw power alone cannot compensate for exhausted logistics. You can possess the most advanced weapons on the planet, but if you cannot sustain their use, replace what gets destroyed, and support ongoing operations indefinitely, that advanced technology eventually stops mattering in any practical sense. There's a particularly striking historical comparison worth mentioning here. Decades ago, an American aircraft carrier sailed directly through this very same strategic waterway, now considered far too dangerous to approach and docked without hesitation. Today, that same level of confidence simply doesn't exist anymore. Major naval assets are being kept at a cautious distance, a quiet but powerful signal of how dramatically the balance of deterrence has shifted over time. At the same time, active duty ground force numbers remain far smaller than historical wartime deployments seen in previous major conflicts across this same region, raising real questions about whether large-scale ground operations are even realistically possible anymore. When you combine limited ground forces, cautious naval positioning, and stretched precision weapons stockpiles, You start to see a military structure originally designed for a completely different era. Now facing a prolonged, multi-front conflict, it may not be fully equipped to sustain over the long run. And here, perhaps, is the most important realization buried inside this entire story. For decades, global military dominance rested on the assumption that no rival force could seriously challenge it, anywhere, under any circumstances. That assumption is now being tested in real time, not through one dramatic, decisive battle, but through a slow, grinding war of attrition unfolding across multiple fronts simultaneously. Every stalled negotiation, every unexpected strike, every strained supply line chips away at that old assumption a little further. This raises a genuinely haunting question worth sitting with. If the most powerful military infrastructure in modern history is struggling to sustain a war against opponents once considered far weaker, what does that actually reveal about the true balance of global power today? Maybe real strength was never really about the size of an arsenal in the first place. Maybe it was always about endurance, about who can keep going the longest once the fighting becomes hard, expensive, and exhausting for everyone involved. History tends to agree with this more often than people expect. Empires rarely collapse from a single lost battle. They collapse slowly, from the weight of wars they could no longer afford to keep fighting. Right now, based on nearly every piece of evidence coming out of this rapidly escalating war, one side appears to be running out of that endurance far faster than anyone in power ever expected or publicly admitted. And that single shift, quiet, unglamorous, buried inside spreadsheets of missile costs and fuel shortages, may end up mattering more in the long run than any single battlefield victory or defeat ever could. Wars are rarely won by the side making the loudest threats. They're decided slowly, painfully, by the side that can keep functioning long after the other side runs out of options. If this conflict continues on its current path, the real turning point may never arrive through some dramatic military breakthrough at all. It may arrive quietly, in a budget meeting, in a supply report, in the exact moment. Someone in power finally admits there simply isn't enough left to keep going. And when that moment comes, the entire balance of power in this region, and quite possibly far beyond it, could shift in ways the world isn't ready to fully understand yet, reshaping alliances, trade routes, and assumptions about power that have stood unchallenged for generations. 9,000 missiles later, Iran hasn't backed down, and the side everyone assumed was unstoppable is quietly running out of road. If this breakdown finally helped you understand what's really happening inside this rapidly spreading conflict, subscribe now, because this story is far from finished, and when the next major shift happens, you'll want to already understand exactly what it means.